Aló, buenos días.
Vamos a probar
A los
interpretación.
intérpretes, ¿me escuchan?
Sí, te escuchamos, Fernando.
Dame un segundo, Barry, que voy a conferir con webcast. Inglés. ¿Tú lo cambias? Ok, perfecto. Gracias. Perfecto, Kelly. Se escucha muy bien, gracias. Nos vamos a español, cabina de español.
Buenos días, Regina, en cabina de español. ¿Se escucha bien?
Regina.
Buenos días, está la Cobra en cabina española, ¿me oyen bien? Buenos días, ok, apago, hasta luego.
Ahora pasamos a portugués, cabina de portugués. Portugués, probando portugués. Cabina de portugués. Cabina de portugués. Bien. Perfeito, muito bem. Obrigado. Segunda consola de português. Bom dia. Isso mesmo, que faltou hoje de manhã. Já voltou, já estamos tudo certo. Muito obrigado, vocês também. E por último, francés. Probando cabina de francés. Perfecto, excelente, gracias. Segunda consola de francés. Perfecto, gracias a ti.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días. Si alguien del despacho del señor Funes está conectado, si puede por favor pedir la palabra para probar que todo está bien.
Aló. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Buenos días, los que
Good morning. We would ask you to please take your seats. And those states that are represented here, we ask you to please take your seats as well. We will begin in just a few minutes. We have a technical issue that we are resolving, but we're making headway on it. So I would ask you to please begin taking your seats.
Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Good morning, everyone. Rogamos a los miembros de las delegaciones que por favor se acerquen a sus lugares para que tengamos un listado correcto de las delegaciones presentes y para que podamos iniciar nuestra.
I'm going to ask everyone to take their seats.
We kindly ask the members of the delegations to come to their places so we can have an accurate list of the delegations that are present and so that we can begin our proceedings this morning. Muy buenos días. Rogamos a las delegaciones tomar sus lugares para que podamos iniciar nuestra sesión esta mañana. Good morning, everyone. We ask delegations to please take their places so we can start our session this morning. También rogamos a las personas en sala que vamos a iniciar nuestros procedimientos y entonces, por favor, necesitamos guardar un poco de silencio. We ask delegations who are in the Hall of the Americas to please remain quiet so that we can start our proceedings this morning. Dale, presidente.
Muy bien.
Very well. We are going to begin this session. Distinguished heads of delegation, permanent and alternate representatives of the OAS member states. Mr. Secretary General Luis Almagro, Mr. Assistant Secretary General Ambassador Nestor Mendez, secretaries of the various areas of the General Secretariat, dear representatives of civil society, workers, the private sector, and social stakeholders. It is my honor to welcome you to this dialogue of the heads of delegation, the Secretary General, the Assistant Secretary General, and the representatives of civil society, workers, and private sector and other social actors, which seeks to promote and facilitate the participation and contribution of civil society and social actors in this 53rd regular session of the OAS General Assembly. Before beginning this dialogue, I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Mr. Luis Almagro. Thank you, Chairman. The topic is to strengthen a culture of democratic responsibility to protect human rights in the Americas. Today, we welcome you to the Hall of the Americas to reflect jointly and hear your perspectives on how we can move forward with this joint responsibility to foster democratic culture focused on human rights. We welcome the representatives of the member states, representatives of civil society, the indigenous communities, workers, as well as Afro-descendants, among others. We welcome all of you, and we value the efforts that your organizations undertake to participate virtually or here in person. We understand that we have made it through a complex pandemic, and today we are in a transformed world. We have to recognize what we had to live in recent years. This time that we have lived allows us to focus on strengthening our democratic system, and we need to recognize the realities of many people who are living in extreme poverty, those that are living in anti-democratic regimes, those who have lost their land, other people who are affected by discrimination. We recognize the voices of these people today through spokespeople here at this dialogue, representing those who could not be with us. There are more than 186 civil society organizations that are part of the official registry of the OAS. And this is a list that continues to grow, and it shows the commitment of civil society to continue working with our organization hand in hand, and it highlights the importance of the work of the OAS and how the OAS member states can continue to encourage and foster a forum for multilateralism. We are here to strengthen democracy. To do so, we must work together. We must work in solidarity so that marginalized peoples that have been historically marginalized can have a worthy life. A true democratic culture is only built if we protect and ensure human rights of all. We cannot backslide. Over the years, the member states have gone through socio-political situations that are complex. Our history is not linear, but at the end of the day, we have been able to come together to strengthen a culture of respect for human rights of all people without distinction, regardless of their identity, their sexual orientation, gender expression, religion, or other factors. In our hemisphere, our North Star is to work to ensure access to rights for all people, and this requires that we listen actively, and that is why we have this meeting today. A dialogue means an exchange of ideas, a discussion. We know that hate speech and arguments go against plurality and democracy, so we cannot silence those who do not share our points of view. We make a call to those that this dialogue can be an example. We will listen to women who are constantly facing inequality and other challenges. We must hear from the Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. We must be respectful to sex workers and also those who are working with immigrants. Those who are here today, we will listen to them. They are with us year after year, and we recognize their efforts. Those who reject and discriminate, who promote violence, must be stopped by promoting democracy and human rights in the region. We recognize that there are many coalitions and organizations here that represent the private sector, workers, youth, and many other groups, and they are part of this dialogue. We value your work, your efforts as social actors, as you work with the OAS and its organs. You are citizens that are committed to promoting a democratic culture and human rights in the hemisphere. We invite the delegations of the member states of the OAS to take advantage of this opportunity and to participate actively in this active dialogue so that we can foster a culture of democratic responsibility and promote human rights. Now, finally, we call upon all to reflect, to move forward, to work, to create those venues where we can propose initiatives that will improve our opportunity for cooperation and exchange so that all of us can move forward together in a hemisphere with more rights for more people. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary General. So, in this venue, the spokespersons of the coalitions of civil society and social actors, as well as representatives of workers and the private sector, will have the opportunity to present to the member states the inputs or reflection of their work that they have carried out, as well as recommendations regarding the theme of this General Assembly, and I quote, strengthening a culture of democratic accountability with promotion, protection, and equality of human rights in the Americas, close quotes. The constructive and proactive contributions of civil society and social actors are essential to nurture and enrich the discussions and deliberations of the member states and strengthen the activities of the organization. This dialogue is going to last 4 hours. 4 hours. Taking into account the time constraints, the interventions of each spokesperson will be limited to a maximum of 3 minutes each. I invite everyone to respect this speaking time, since at the end of 3 minutes, the microphones will be turned off automatically. So you'll need to do some mental editing if you have something that's much larger. Please take that into account because it would be very sad to see your message cut off. Likewise, the representatives of the member states present here today will have the opportunity to respond to the presentations made by civil society and the social actors on 4 different occasions. So, to that end, at the end of each of the 4 rounds of interventions by the spokespersons of this dialogue, I will give the floor to the representatives of the member states so that they may refer to the presentations and recommendations presented. We would also ask them to also be as brief as possible. The first round of interventions will include 2 worker representatives and 1 private sector representative. The second round of interventions will include 9 presentations from civil society coalitions and social actors. The third round of interventions will include presentations by 12 civil society groups and social actors. And the fourth and final round will consist of 11 interventions. The dialogue will conclude at 1 p.m. So we're going to move to the first round of interventions. We will begin by hearing from 2 spokespersons that represent millions of workers grouped in the main trade union centers and confederations of the Americas. To begin, I give the floor to Mr. Julio Rosales, representative of the presidency of the Trade Union Technical Advisory Council, COSATE. Mr. Rosales, it is virtual and the floor is yours. You may connect now.
Adelante, señor Rosales, y ahí está.
Sí.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm here to represent the president of COSATE, which is headed up by Marta Bujate, and also in representation of the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas. Greetings to the OAS, delegations, and social actors. I want to talk about the necessary participation of the trade union movement in the OAS. At our 4th Congress of the Trade Union Confederation, we affirmed that peace, democracy, and human rights are fundamental for the working class. And in this sense, we are concerned about discriminatory and hate speech that we see in our societies that are creating hate and are undermining democracy and harmonious coexistence. We need public policies that lead to social dialogue and make technology something useful for democracy, something that will create tolerance and allow for the exercise of rights. As we have said in COSATE's statement for this General Assembly, we promote institutionalized social dialogue as a tool to build consensus and to mobilize a roadmap for sustainable development with social justice. We assert that trade unions are socio-political actors and our participation should not be limited just to the labor movement. We want to participate in democratic dialogue so we can have a new social compact. suppression and criminalization of protests, violations of the right to belong to a trade union is hurting social dialogue. The proactive role of governments to promote and correct the freedoms of workers and the trade union movement, this is fundamental to create dialogue and consensus in society. We would point out that the governments in the region, in the framework of tripartite entities, must have public policies that will address the structural problems in our region, the most unequal on the planet. In order to do so, we must create capacity in government so we have a just energy transition and an adaptation of the future of work, which includes technology in production and new ways of working and producing. We request the cooperation of the OAS to further cooperation and dialogue in the Americas, respecting sovereignty of all countries and self-determination of peoples. We support peaceful processes so that we can have a region that is free of war. Our democracies demand regional integration, coordination between the sectors in society.
Bien.
So that was actually 4 minutes. We thank Mr. Rosales. We will now continue with the second intervention, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Nahuel Placanica. He is the spokesperson representing the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas and the Trade Union Technical Advisory Council. Thank you very much. Greetings to OAS authorities, delegations, representatives of management. Trade unions are those that defend democratic institutionality. Democracy is necessary to represent workers and to define the future of our nations and regions. Social justice and human rights are collective aspirations. Freedom to join a trade union is key with respect to human rights, but we see violations in many, many states in this respect. We see persecutions, kidnappings, killings, smear campaigns, and discrimination of those in trade unions. This undermines social dialogue. We are concerned about restrictions on the rights of trade unions and workers. We would demand that states comply with the court's advisory opinion 2721. We work and want to work with social actors to have sustainable development and to have decent work. We see multiple crises throughout the world, and this is very negative for our societies who are facing structural difficulties, the informal economy, the gender breach, harassment, child labor, the lack of social protection network, the digital divide, the lack of decent work, the lack of education. This is affecting our young people. We cannot allow this to continue. We need urgent responses, collectively thought out. We want to see development in the Americas. We have published a document recently to call upon the Americas to take steps in this sense. The impact of climate change and technological changes like AI must be addressed in a framework of social justice and thinking about the rights of workers from the perspective of intersectionality, and in which we reflect on different factors which lead to discrimination. We see that conflict and the climate crisis is leading to migration and the migration crisis in our continent. We must have protection for migrants in all countries, no matter what their status. We affirm that involvement in democracy and development projects that are just will strengthen democracy and allow us to meet the expectations of young people in our society. We reiterate that an institutionalized democratic framework which will protects human rights and workers' rights is fundamental to be able to actually reach our goals under the 2030 agenda. We will continue to support the trade union agenda in all countries. We hope that Cruzate's statement will be taken into account in your political dialogue. Thank you very much. We now continue with the intervention of representatives of the private sector. We will hear now from Mr. Daniel Funes de Rioja. He is president of the Business Committee for Technical Advice on Labor Matters, CEATAL. Mr. Funes, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I also would like to thank the Secretary General and the OAS, distinguished representatives of government, and colleagues who are participating. Thank you for allowing us to speak. We are convinced only democracy, and not just supposed democracy, constitutional order, fundamental rights are the suitable framework which will allow for integral development for our peoples and nations. Based on this, there are, of course, different circumstances in the countries: access to education, the rule of law, creation of an economic social order which will allow for development which is inclusive, and to create the necessary circumstances to reduce the informal economy, which is a symptom of bad tax policy, and the need to set realistic goals for SMEs that are suffering because of bad policies. We also believe international organizations and the multilateral system have to play a key role which can help social coexistence, and there are many agencies on an international level that can help with effective cooperation. Our current circumstances are challenging. We see the dynamics of the chain of supplies which have suffered because of the pandemic. This is particularly true in our region, and this was pointed out by the Secretary General in his initial remarks. The private sector wants to meet the challenges of investment and to create good jobs. We need more investment to do that, and labor realities must be taken into account. This It has to do with changes that have taken place. Digitalization of the economy are a reality. This is a challenge for all sectors. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean should take advantage of these technologies to give a leap forward in their production, which accordingly will lead to a better standard of living. But we have a long way to go. We have seen platforms appear which have helped employment, which have included many informal workers into the formal economy. These technologies must be used strategically to reduce the informal economy, and they have also helped many entrepreneurs move forward and create employment. This is a matter that affects the labor market. There is a lack of competencies, skills, and capacities. It means we need to change our curriculums. We need to change our education system because these curricula are not aligned with what businesses needs. So adjustments must be made in order to have internships, to improve technical education, streamline certifications for students. This will allow us to have more productivity, competitiveness, and create formal employment.
Estamos con ese tema de los tiempos.
Again, I would remind you that everyone keep in mind you have 3 minutes. With that, we will be concluding this segment. And now we would like to give the floor to those member states who would like to weigh in. We would like to greet representatives and ministers, vice ministers. Thank you for being here. So we would like to open up the floor to member states who would like to speak. Colombia, you have the floor. No, excuse me. Brazil has the floor. Excellencies, honorable delegates. Yes, we can hear you. Excuse me. We have a little conflict here between Brazil and Colombia. I know there's no conflict. I'm just joking. First of all, we had Brazil on the list first, but then we saw Colombia. Brazil, go ahead.
Gracias. Bom dia.
Good morning, everyone. It is with great happiness that I participate in this dialogue with representatives from civil society and other actors. The reconstruction of the different spaces with civil society and the strengthening of public policies are priorities of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. New ministers, human right for women and also for indigenous peoples have been created to ensure that the aspirations of civil society can be better channeled. These priorities are also seen in our foreign policy. We know that it is important to give broad social participation in our foreign policy so that the Brazilian society can be seen by the outside world. We are working to strengthen social participation, and I reiterate the position of the Brazilian government to permanently keep an open communication to hear ideas from different representatives here today. The topic chosen for this General Assembly could not be more timely. Democratic accountability and equality of human rights are linked. These values are part of the origin of the OAS, and they are 2 of the 4 fundamental pillars. So the organization is the natural place to defend and strengthen our continent. I am particularly excited about human rights because we must defend human rights in the Americas. Brazil recognizes the organs of the OAS, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We are committed to reach this objective, and we will more and more active in the debates of the organization on women, racism, racial discrimination, and the rights of the LGBTI community. And the racial discrimination and other forms of intolerance must be fought against as well. And there is a group of countries to address this. We are ready to address other topics such as Down syndrome, autism, and Paralympic sports, among others. We remind this body that Brazil is part of the core LGBTI group in the OAS and will continue to be active in this area internationally. I want to say also that Brazil seeks to support human rights defenders as well through a national program in 2007. There are more than 500 people throughout the country that are working to protect indigenous and traditional communities that are found in the Amazon region. It is in this spirit that we establish our work in the OAS, and we know that our work will be part of a dialogue with independent experts and others to continue to improve the Inter-American human rights system and ensure predictability in the system, in particular the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Brazil also is going to deepen discussion at the OAS on topics of direct interest to our citizens. We are aware that ensuring the basic conditions for development of our people is our main responsibility in all international fora. These are the basis for democracy and the respect for human rights. We are working to have greater impetus into that pillar of the organization. It has a long list of topics that have to do with cultural, economic, scientific, and technological topics. We must explore the potential of addressing these issues together in the OAS because it can improve the conditions of our peoples and in this post-pandemic reality that we are now living in. We can consider that CD is an important part of this work, and we are aware that it will be necessary to have a dialogue that is in greater detail and deeper with civil society. Brazil wants to ensure that voices are heard. There is no effective multilateralism if it does not reflect the aspirations of the people. Civil society must act in a free and democratic way. Thank you very much.
Muy bien.
Thank you very much. We thank the Vice Minister of Brazil for her remarks. As I see no further requests for the floor from member states, we will move on to our second round of interventions. Now we have representatives of civil society and social actors. And so I would like to begin inviting the Dialogue or Inclusive Dialogues Coalition representative by Mr. Enrique de Barrio of the Latin American Caribbean Network for Democracy, Red Lad. Mr. de Barrio, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, friends. To strengthen democracy, one of the most important things we have is the educational system, and this has to do with teacher training. If we do not do this strengthening, then our democracies will spiral into autocracy. The democratic responsibility, it has to do with a balance of power, and we must have weights and counterweights. We also need to exercise our civil duties and our civil rights. We must be responsible. The necessary decisions to improve security must always respect human rights. Democratic responsibility means that we need to also fight against corruption. Corruption continues to be one of the main issues or factors that is eroding our democracies. The scourge of corruption, however, is not just in the public sector or the government sector. Democratic accountability means we must protect human rights, civil rights, citizen participation, and we must reduce inequalities. We must have clear measures to protect people and their human rights and ensure freedom of expression. Advocacy of human rights is indispensable. Without these rights, we have no democracy. Thus, the priority must be on vulnerable groups, including young people and children, older people, those who have diverse sexual orientation, indigenous peoples, and peoples with disability. There is no democracy if civil society does not have the minimum requirements to be able to operate. The OAS has measures to protect democracy, but they have flaws. So we are happy to see that measures are being taken to protect democracy. For example, peer-to-peer networks and the inclusion of the academic sector, private sector, civil society, and that there is an early warning system being set up. We need to have common citizens involved. We need to have more referendums and recalls of politicians, an open parliament.
Muy bien.
Very well. We thank you very much for your remarks. We would now like to give the floor to Maria Elisa Obiols Ordóñez. She represents the coalition Life and Family. And please keep in mind the time limit you have. Otherwise, your message is interrupted and we don't understand all of these substantive ideas you'd like to share with us. So please take that into account. Ms. Obiols, you have the floor. Excellencies, ambassadors, representatives, Mr. Secretary General, as spokesperson for the coalition Life and Family, I have the honor of representing the will of 79 associations. The coalition has the mission of promoting the right to life, ensuring the inherent universal and inalienable dignity of human beings. This is the principle and foundation in which all rights are recognized, beginning with the right to life from conception. The human being in all his and her stages is the bearer of this dignity that exalts him and reserves for him the set of most solid guarantees of any legal system that protects human rights. This was recognized by states and reflected in the convention. That is why we are astonished by the actions of some organs of this organization, which insist on imposing visions biased by ideologies that are not only alien but also violate human dignity. We are referring to the role played by the Inter-American Commission on around human rights, betraying its mandate. In the 21st century, a century in which science is advancing to such a degree that it enables us to verify the very moment from which humans begin to exist, the IACHR refuses to recognize the protection of life in the womb, leaving the decision to the will of women, who today can arbitrarily decide whether the baby is allowed to live or condemned to death. This was the position presented by the ICHR in the case of Beatriz versus El Salvador. This ideologized role is shown in the increasingly undisguised form of the way they are acting. In that case, the experts presented and supported by the IACHR denied all dignity to the unborn human being. We have also had to deplore arbitrary behavior on the part of different secretariats that make up the structure of the OAS, adopting positions when promoting the activities of civil society and silencing the voices that disagree with their ideology, far from contributing to the strengthening of a culture of democratic accountability with the promotion, protection, and equality of human rights. This type of behavior weakens and alters the legitimacy of the system vis-a-vis the peoples of the Americas, who helplessly see how the scope of the convention is manipulated. This coalition will always work to defend the right to life of every human being, regardless of the stage in which they find themselves or their personal condition. It will not stop denouncing the abuses and arbitrariness that are committed against this right. We therefore urge member states, and especially you ambassadors who represent us, to assume the commitment to accompany pregnant women who are in a situation of vulnerability, respecting their dignity, but also the dignity of the child they carry. Stop using the inter-American system to violate people's human rights.
Muchas gracias.
Very well. Thank you very much. Now, we would like to invite Elizabeth Francisca Campos Sanchez of the Commission of Blind Women of Peru, CODEEP, to take the floor as spokesperson for the Coalition for the Dignity of Persons with Disabilities in the Americas. Ms. Campos, you have the floor.
We are connecting right now, and please let me know if everything is in order and ready. Ms. Campos, please go ahead. I represent the Latin American Union of the Blind and a network of disabled people, and also from a number of other organizations. We also today want to present to the Assembly our concern. We are 3 years from celebrating the second decade of the Americas of people with disabilities, and we are concerned that today states continue to discriminate against people who are disabled. We do not see truly inclusive public policies that ensure education, employment, and participation of people with disabilities within your countries. In this regard, we would like to request the Secretary General to convene, forgive me, I'm a little bit nervous, to ask the Permanent Council to have a specialized meeting in which the organizations of people with disabilities of the Americas, so that we can assess the progress that has been made in inclusion policies for people with disabilities, and to truly assess what is being done in countries to ensure non-discrimination of people with disabilities. And we ask that there be a constant effort so that in countries the assurances are provided so that disabled people can have access to civil society spaces and be able to dialogue with the states so that people with disabilities have true access to all fora so that they can participate in equality of conditions. We are concerned that we see exclusion and that people with disabilities are not recognized as full citizens with all rights, and that they are discriminated against, and they are continuing in some places to institutionalize people with disabilities in our countries. So, Secretary General, we ask that the OAS convene these conferences, these meetings, so that people with disabilities can promote strategies and tools that allow us to make a change, to ensure inclusion, to ensure democratic participation of all people with disabilities in the Americas. Exceptional. Thank you. I now invite you to hear from Ana Maria Diez from the Coalition for Venezuela. On behalf of the Coalition for Venezuela, Ms. Diez, you have the floor. Good morning, everyone. I recognize all the authorities present here today. It's an honor for me to speak to you all at this 53rd General Assembly. This is my first speech as the president of the Coalition for Venezuela. It is time to talk about the elephant in the room. Venezuela is not fixed. It is in a crisis. It is a multifaceted, complex, live crisis. It is a latent crisis in our region, and it is far from finding a solution. So we cannot simply sit on our hands when there is so much that still needs to be done. We cannot underestimate the impact of the huge movement of Venezuelan citizens throughout the region. I want to give you just a few numbers here. According to the latest numbers, according to R4V, 70% of Venezuelans that return to their country do so because of the problems with integration systems, and they are not necessarily going back. For every 9 Venezuelans that come to Brazil, 1 leaves. Colombia has become a transit country, and there are still thousands of people, mainly Venezuelans, that are going through the Darien Gap. And I was there 3 days ago, and I could see it. How many lives will continue to be lost? How many children will have to cross for a second time one of the most dangerous areas in the world? There is no constructive narrative in Venezuela. It is undeniable, and the numbers speak for themselves. This is a crisis that is not so much humanitarian. It is because of a lack of integration, but it is a crisis. It is a crisis that has evolved. So Venezuela at this time continues to have levels of inequality that are similar to Angola and Mozambique. And in this regard, let me simply highlight 2 lines of action. First, strengthening regional cooperation. We need more shared dialogue opportunities to be able to strengthen regional cooperation based on shared principles of solidarity. But if we hope to have tangible changes, we must have efficient efforts, and we must integrate the refugees and immigrants into this. It must be nothing for us without us. That must be a premise of our work. Finally, the issue of integration that is failing. We cannot see this as something ethereal. We have specific situations where they need to be able to have their university diplomas revalidated. We are not in a position to put We must do this throughout the Americas. Thank you very much. I am now pleased to give the floor to the representative of the Citizen Forum of the Americas Coalition, Ms. Patricia Galvez of the Ecuadorian Center for Development and Alternative Studies, CIDEAL. Ms. Galvez, you have the floor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the OAS. We are here at a new version of the General Assembly as the Forum of the Americas. This is the 7th time we have spoken. We lament that the recommendations and the concerns that we bring here continue to be the same. Some of them have not changed. In fact, they have only gotten worse. This is saddening, but we can't let our guard down, because our focus will be on the strengthening of democracy and strengthening and defending human rights. We recognize the representatives of political actors and social actors that are here, but we also are concerned that many are not here today. In this regard, we once again exhort to call upon all to show a willingness to work on the following issues: the violation of human rights and the weakening of the rule of law, fighting corruption, especially in the digital area, gender-based violence, migratory crises, and also environmental crises. We are very concerned about the first two that are linked to the central issue of the Assembly, which is strengthening a culture of democratic accountability with promotion, protection, and equality of human rights in the Americas. The violation of human rights leads to a weakening of the rule of law. This is a constant problem. We are concerned about Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and in El Salvador, Peru, and Guatemala. The policies in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico are also of concern. We make a call to ensure that actors are protected that are at the head of social movements that fight for human rights and are fighting for greater transparency. We must recognize the right of civil society to protest peacefully and to ensure that their lives will be protected when they go to the streets. We must recognize democratic principles and free and fair elections throughout the region. And we must ensure that we have inclusive public policies that include underrepresented groups, women, indigenous groups, Afro-descendant groups, minority religious groups, and people who have other diverse identities. We must ensure that we have sustainable efforts, and we must recognize the systemic and other characteristics of each system. We need priority mechanisms to ensure that we can stop violence against women. There is a need also to ensure that people can live lives without violence and that their rights will be respected and they have access to greater opportunities, in particular for the youth of the Americas. We finally exhort that the OAS and the member states take urgent action on these points that have been previously mentioned, especially very well. Very good. We will now give the floor to Mr. John Walsh from WOLA, who will speak on behalf of the American Coalition on Drug Policy. John Walsh, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente, y buenos días.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning.
UN human rights experts proclaim that the so-called war on drugs undermines health and social well-being, wastes public resources while failing to curb the demand for illegal drugs or curtail illegal drug markets. They also noted that current policies have far-reaching negative implications for a wide range of human rights, including the rights to personal liberty, fair trial and equal treatment before the law, health, adequate housing, and a clean and healthy environment, freedoms of expression, religion, assembly, and association, freedom from forced labor, ill treatment, and torture, and freedom from discrimination. It is obvious to us, as citizens of the Americas, that drug policies focused on prohibition, criminalization, eradication, and militarization are counterproductive, and that drug consumption and trafficking have not diminished in our region. The urgent need to create drug policies based on respect for human rights was installed on the hemispheric agenda a decade ago. This was reflected in the June 2014 OAS resolution on promotion and protection of human rights in the search for new approaches and effective solutions in the development and implementation of policies for addressing the world drug problem in the Americas. But despite some important advances in several countries, the task of promoting human rights in drug policy is still incipient and requires a renewed commitment from all member states in collaboration with civil society. We thus urge member states to end repressive drug policies, end the criminalization of people who use drugs, and ensure alternatives to incarceration for drug-related offenses. Address problems associated with drug use and dependence from a public health perspective. Guarantee universal and voluntary access to high-quality prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, harm reduction, and social integration services with a gender focus. Facilitate unrestricted access to health care for persons with problematic drug use who are deprived of liberty. Do not apply policies that put at greater risk the lives of indigenous, peasant, and Afro-descendant communities that cultivate crops deemed to be illicit. Finally, we urge OAS member states, with the full participation of civil society, to reopen an inclusive and taboo-free debate on the design and implementation of drug policies with a vision anchored in human rights, health, and sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Very well. Thank you very much for your presentation. We now will hear from Mercedes Saychaklan, representative of the Regional Indigenous Council, Xipujil Civil Society, as spokesperson for the Coalition Indigenous Coordination, Abya Yala. Ms. Saychaklan, you have the floor. Thank you and good morning. Luis Almagro Lemes, Secretary General of the OAS, representatives of the states, and to all brothers and sisters who are watching virtually. We salute all of you here today of the 53rd General Assembly of the Organization of American States, virtually and in person. My voice is the voice of the Coalition Indigenous Coalition Abya Yala, in accordance with the topic of this assembly, which is strengthening a culture of democratic responsibility and the promotion, protection, and equality of human rights in the Americas, and that our collective rights as subjects of rights and our legal personality in our Abya Yala may be implemented through various mechanisms and work groups as part of the responsibility of every actor in our Abya Yala. Therefore, we state the following: our profound concern and indignation with the hostile environment or at-risk situation in which our fellow Indigenous brothers and sisters live, who have been denouncing constant attacks, harassment, criminalization, and murders for defending their territory, as well as to demand our right to self-determination recognized in Article 3 of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within the framework of the consent of our peoples. In exercising our rights as established in Article 29 of the Declaration, no to mega projects, no to the privatization and contamination of water, mining, or logging, or fossil fuels extraction, or genetically modified products, and yes to the right of a healthy environment that allows for good living standards. As established in Article 18, the right to enjoy a high level of health, this is not achieved because of a lack of education, and this leads to a high level of maternal death. And we see that many children are becoming mothers because they are not receiving any reproductive education, and this infringes on one of their greatest human rights. We recognize that there are indigenous brothers and sisters that are killed is growing, and because they are peacefully protesting, as we are seeing in Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and Guatemala. We demand a ceasing of the repression, and this should be done with the CIDH in cooperation with our peoples. In the same manner, we demand a cease in the discrimination and marginalization. Very well. We are going to ask the room officials that if you can somehow cut the external noise. We're hearing a lot of additional noise coming from outside of the room, and it is actually affecting the meeting. We will now hear from the coalition Self-Determination of the Peoples versus Institutional Corruption, whose spokesperson is Ms. Maria Paula Aldana of Género F Civil Association. Ms. Aldana, you have the floor. Ambassadors and representatives of civil society. In the American continent, we are seeing alarming corruption. In Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti are among the 15 most corrupt in the world. This has serious consequences for the entire population because it weakens institutions and leads to a development of criminal groups, and it affects our entire continent. The Inter-American human rights system is the exception to institutional corruptions. Its legal framework establishes the rights that are recognized and protected. The difference of different actors have led to a distortion of these rights in documents and resolutions that have been issued by the Commission and the Inter-American Court. For example, legalization of abortion throughout the region, and there are also women who are affected by sexual violence in Mesoamerica. And this was not published because of the UNFPA and the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. We highlight the strong interest of Canada in promoting a radical agenda for abortion through significant donations to different mechanisms of the OAS, especially the Inter-American Commission of Women, and also in the Belén do Pará Declaration, and subjecting that to the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court. The permissibility of this organization and the actions of this country is an example of corruption in the inter-American system. Abortion is not a right within the framework of international law. It is and will always be violence against women. While we wait for a resolution of the case of Beatriz against El Salvador in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we demand that the judges of the courts adhere to their mandate and recognize that the first right of all inhabitants of the continent and the world is a right to life. Corruption is when international organizations are sequestered. And they talk of human rights, but they openly promote the violation of human rights, and based on agendas and individual institutions, but not in protection of individuals. There is a gender ideology, and the imposition of abortion puts women and young women and adolescents and makes them the main victims of this new colonization. And they should have a right to a free determination of peoples. As a civil society organization, we demand that the OAS adhere to its mandate based on the international instruments that regulate it.
Bien.
Very well. We are now going to close this first round of comments with the presentation by Mr. Arim Nabi Aquino Santillán of Calacoaya Centro Cultural AC, who will speak as spokesperson for the Coalition Education and Culture for Democracy. Mr. Aquino, you have the floor. The Coalition Education and Culture for Democracy participates in protests the way that several organizations have been affected. Heads of delegation and representatives, we recall that the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights in Article 12, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 26, establishes the right of parents to choose the education that their children receive. It is clear that the exercise of their rights is one of the key issues in international law and in the development of society. And is one of the most crucial issues that parents are facing due to the growing wave of interventionism when it comes to the family. The right of custody is a right of parents for their children. Parents have this right. They are the ones that are going to represent, not the state. When there are conditions that affect a minor, the child cannot go and look for separate legal representation. The posture that has prevailed in many countries is based on the correct presumption that love that parents have for our children makes us responsible for them more than anyone else. So it guarantees the protection of children and the fundamental right of parents and children. On this basis, we establish the legal tool or instrument that has three main points. One, the right of parents to decide on the education for their children, and therefore we wish to manifest their disagreement and having their children participate in activities that go against their convictions. Number two, in this regard, the education authorities must recognize parents and inform them of their activities before the fact, especially when it comes to sexuality and values, to ensure that education is scientifically based and age appropriate. Number three, parents or tutors of children or legal guardians of children must be able to avoid any discrimination by education authorities. Therefore, we call upon the governments of the American continent that they stop intervening in the family. Second, that they respect the preferential rights that parents have to educate their children and to have strategies that ensure that this right will be promoted and observed in educational institutions so that what is on paper will become a reality. Very well. So, we conclude this round of interventions by the civil society coalitions and social actors. The member states now have the floor if they wish to take it. Colombia, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Chairman. Excellencies, honorable delegates, representatives of civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Colombia values this dialogue. this constructive dialogue within the framework of the General Assembly of our organization and invites the member states to recognize the importance and to assume the joint responsibility of strengthening the inter-American system for human rights. Our role in our country highlights the role of the the American Convention on Human Rights as expressed by Gustavo Petro. It includes the key principles for strengthening liberal democracy throughout the continent, and it is becoming the democratic constitution of America. And its actions should lead to having all citizens of the Americas to live with guarantees that their rights will be respected. Colombia has established a plan of action through social dialogue and on the basis of transformations that are necessary for Colombian society and our international commitments internationally when it comes to human rights. Our government is committed with the following fundamental aspects. First, to move forward with the relationship between the climate crisis, human rights, and environmental justice. That is why in January of 2023 with Chile, we presented a request for a consultative opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights with the purpose of accelerating and achieving state responsibilities to respond to the climate emergency. And keep in mind the differentiated results on different people in different regions and groups of population when it comes to surviving on our planet. This is why we have insisted on the different international areas on the need to ensure that we have financial mechanisms, innovative financial mechanisms, including exchanging debt for climate action to address the challenges to protect our ecosystems and communities that are highly vulnerable today. Second, to prioritize the preparation and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, blacks, Afro-descendants, and other ethnic communities based on recognizing pluri-ethnical and pluricultural nature of our countries. This is why Francia Marquez, the First Lady of Colombia, has worked on the creation of an intersectoral commission that includes historical reparations that will allow us to overcome the effects of racism, racial discrimination, and colonialism in the ethnic populations of the country. Third, to maintain the firm commitment as a government for gender equality. And in 2023, we have removed from the 3 declarations on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Equally, we want to ensure that we have paid the historic debt with women of our country, and we are working in a participatory fashion to create a national effort to support the Declaration on Women, Peace, and Security. This is long overdue. We are also working with environmental leaders to be able to provide full guarantees to ensure that we have freedom of the press, and we have ratified the Agreement of Esquazú, and we have also been working with the Inter-American, the IACHR, to address issues that have that emerged in 2021 in Colombia. And migration is an issue of the greatest priority. Colombia, within its commitments, we are going to work with the states of the region, and we led in this assembly with Chile a focus on migrant children. And we are also working on other migratory topics to reach mechanisms and agreements that will allow us to achieve a way to improve this situation in the region. Now, lastly, this is the time to, again, invite countries to commit to a drug policy that gives life priority. And particularly in civil society, this is important. Together with all of the other initiatives of the Colombian government, are allowing us to move forward to build total peace that gives opportunities to our population to live a life free of violence based on justice and reconciliation. Thank you.
Gracias, Vice.
Thank you, Vice Minister. United States has the floor.
I'm honored to join you here today. My name is Enrique Roig, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Human Rights and Labor. The United States champions universal values, including respect for the rule of law, democratic institutions, and human rights. We do this through our bilateral relations, active participation in multilateral organizations, our annual country reports on human rights, and various tools of diplomacy. Our work helps bolster democratic institutions, confront democratic backsliding, promote accountability, uphold internationally recognized labor standards, and advance the rights and equity of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and religious communities, indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, and LGBTQI+ persons. My State Department Bureau, DRL, is sometimes called the NGO within the State Department. We work directly with social actors, civil society organizations, which are crucial to helping us do our job. They meet with us, conduct research and investigation, and make recommendations that informs our policymaking. This work helps inform our efforts here at the Organization of American States, and we value your advocacy and opinions. The United States firmly believes that a robust civil society, independent of state control or government involvement, is necessary for democracy to thrive. From the earliest days of U.S. history, civil society organizations have played a key role in protecting human rights and advancing human progress. Civil society is a source of all-encompassing ideas, promoting everything from transparency and free expression, reversing inequality, and rescuing our environment. Approximately 1.5 million NGOs operate in the United States. These NGOs undertake a wide array of activities, including political advocacy on issues such as elections, foreign policy, the environment, healthcare, women's rights, rights of marginalized populations, economic development, anti-corruption, rule of law, and many other issues. They often develop and address new approaches to social and economic problems that governments cannot address alone. These include volunteer organizations rooted in shared religious faith, labor unions, groups that help vulnerable people such as the poor, the disabled, and groups that seek to empower youth and other marginalized populations. However, we're not perfect, far from it, but we are always striving to live up to our highest ideals and principles. Citizens here in the United States can speak freely and peacefully protest and criticize our political leaders. They can petition the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and urge for the Commission to undertake monitoring missions to the United States. This occurred just this year in California, Louisiana, and Alaska on issues of homelessness, climate change, and indigenous rights. Members of our free press can also work without fear or interference. And civil society organizations in the United States interact directly with government and elected officials, holding us accountable for our words and actions. This is the strength of a democracy, though it may seem messy and inefficient at times. Across the Americas, discrimination and social exclusion of marginalized communities, including women, and all the diversity clearly undermine democratic governance. Advancing racial equity and justice in our foreign policy is essential to U.S. national security and the strengthening of democracies around the world. Members of marginalized racial and ethnic communities are disproportionately harmed by violence and discrimination. To help ensure our governments are responsive to such concerns, my government is active in several groups of like-minded countries here at the OAS, focused on women's rights and gender, freedom of expression, and the rights of persons with disabilities. As we commemorate Pride Month here in the United States and around the region, and host World Pride in Washington in 2025, we honor a movement for LGBTQI+ rights that has grown stronger, more vibrant, and more inclusive with every passing year. And yet, the occasion is also a reminder that we still have generational work to do to ensure that everyone enjoys the full promise of equity, dignity, protection, and freedom throughout the Americas. To advance those goals, we are a proud founding member of the OAS LGBTQI core group of governments now led by Colombia. Our problems need our continued attention. Corruption and rule of law remain urgent challenges throughout the Americas. In several countries, there continues to be widespread impunity regarding the crisis and disappearances, as well as violence and intimidation against journalists. We recognize the important role of civil society in keeping both regional governments and the United States focused on these issues. As chair of the OAS Committee on Civil Society and the Summit of the Americas activities, the United States has placed these topics on the OAS agenda for action. My government is deeply invested in advancing human rights and fundamental freedoms across the globe and in the Americas. What is happening in countries such as Venezuela and Nicaragua is very concerning. Civil society should be allowed to function freely, and people should be allowed to exercise their right to choose their leaders and move on from corruption and repression. We remain committed to ensuring that civil society maintains an active voice at the OAS, so we can foster the open exchange of ideas so essential to innovation and creative solutions in multilateral bodies. This also means ensuring meaningful access to and participation in this organization's proceedings. Mr. Chair, on this point, we all have work to do. Colleagues, our belief in the inherent value of every person's voice guides our support and funding for the ongoing work of the Inter-American Commission's Unit for Human Rights Defenders, its office as a Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, as well as the new Center for Media Integrity in the Americas launched in Los Angeles on the margins in the 9th Summit of the Americas. At that summit, Civil Society Dialogue USAID Administrator Samantha Power also launched the Voices Initiative, which is working to bring all of the U.S. government's tools to bear to promote digital democracy and freedom of expression, to counter digital authoritarianism, and to strengthen independent media, among other objectives. Colleagues, these concrete actions help us all ensure that the OAS counters democratic backsliding throughout the Americas by following through on collective commitments to make governments serve every citizen better, so that people and all the diversity have the tools to improve their quality of life. In today's Western Hemisphere, characterized by disinformation, heightened polarization, and social inequity, we must consider and apply better early warning strategies, preventative diplomacy tools, and new ways to promote education for democracy and human rights. These three ideas comprise the pending proposals before our Assembly this week on the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and I hope we can count on all of you for your support for their approval. Colleagues, we agree that a strong and vibrant civil society is the key to fighting for more free, inclusive, and democratic governments throughout the Americas. So let's all get to work. I look forward to your recommendations in a productive week here at this Assembly. Thank you.
We're going to give the floor to Paraguay and Guatemala. They did sign up on time. I would ask delegations to please respect the deadline, or rather the time frame you have. We are not going to have a break, however. So, Paraguay, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. Dear representatives of civil society, we are so pleased to participate in this meeting, which shows our willingness to have a more open and inclusive OAS. Indeed, in keeping with openness and inclusiveness is key for the organization. It allows member states to understand the needs and demands of the different sectors in our region on issues that are important to strengthen democracy and further sustainable development. However, we need to do more than just listen to each other. We need to work together in a coordinated manner at different levels: government, civil society, private sector, academic sector, and taking into account the plurality of perspectives we have in our region. My country has taken an attitude that is in keeping with the convention and in keeping with our constitutions. And we will continue to reiterate at all arenas what is enshrined in our constitution, that the right to life is inherent to human beings, and we must protect life from conception. This is a premise that we also see in the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, which is the cornerstone of the Inter-American system. Furthermore, Paraguay will continue to protect the rights of all women. We owe an historic debt to them because they are the ones that brought back our country after the Triple Frontera War. They shouldered the preservation of our culture, our language. For this reason, we believe their rights and opportunities must be respected, and we should not have interpretations that put them at risk. We are aware of our debt to women and reiterate our commitment to continue to achieve true equality for all women in Paraguay and in the region. This is a timely occasion to reiterate Paraguay's commitment to defend life, to defend equality, to defend the family, to freedom of religion and ideology, and freedom of expression and thought. We are convinced that these rights should and must be defended peacefully, respecting all positions, and we will continue to defend our stance based on inalienable principles. We reaffirm our willingness to work with civil society and nations without distinction. So I would invite all delegations to move forward based on consensus, which has defined this organization, avoiding extremist positions that will lead to fragmentation. So we celebrate your participation, and we hope to be able to continue to exchange views on different issues that are in the best interest of our people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Guatemala has the floor. Please go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair. Greetings to you, the honorable delegations here, OAS authorities, civil society, private sector representatives, and social actors. It is an honor to be able to represent our ambassador, who is also the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I am here to further our dialogue and hear from the private sector, civil society organizations, and social actors on important issues. For the government of Guatemala, it is important to address the challenges we are facing to have a sustainable future and one that is prosperous for all. Based on this vision, the Republic, or rather the President of our Republic, Alejandro Giammattei, has been implementing a public policy 2020-2030. And so we want to have results which translate into a strengthened rule of law in Guatemala. Guatemala believes corruption is a threat that affects democracy and weakens our institutions. To this end, we have strengthened mechanisms for transparency, accountability, and justice to be able to fight effectively against corruption in order to prosecute, eradicate, and sanction these practices. We have a public policy to fight against corruption. We also have a cooperation agreement amongst institutions to fight against corruption, which furthers a control of public expenditures, promotes transparency and accountability, and also furthers prosecution of illicit acts. Guatemala is implementing the recommendations of experts under the aegis of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. Chair, we reaffirm the inherent right for all Guatemalan citizens to participate in democratic processes through strengthening of representativity in electoral processes. And we have an election campaign underway. We will be having elections to the Central American Parliament. The OAS is planning to provide a course on consolidating women's participation in politics based on the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, our Constitution, and other multilateral instruments for the state. It is important to protect the human rights of all citizens, ensuring full exercise of those rights, preventing any kind of violence or discrimination. Convinced of our duties, in 2022, Guatemala was named the Ibero-American Capital of Life. This was thanks to the manifest commitment of our government societies to protect life from conception to the moment of natural death. The state reiterates its commitment to life and the family. In March of this year, Guatemala agreed to be the host to the meeting of the Inter-American Convention on Indigenous Rights. We are going to have a working group to follow up on this convention. Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Panama, as well as Peru, have presented a resolution to be adopted at this GA in this sense. Guatemala reiterates that it is working unflaggingly to further the development of our families in Guatemala. We are also taking measures to ensure progress of the peoples in the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
Muy bien.
Thank you very much. Let us now proceed with our third round of interventions. In this round, we're going to hear from young people, and we will hear from spokespersons of civil society organizations. First of all, we are going to hear from Carlos Carrasco, a representative of young people. Carlos, you have the floor. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. In recent years, young people in the region have mobilized in different international arenas to be able to address the great challenges of this time: climate change, the fight against corruption, digital transformation, democracy, inclusiveness, and health, and an issue that affects me directly, migration. Based on this collaborative and joint work, I'd like to share with you some contributions we would like to make to this process, which we hope are just not left on paper but become action. Climate change, there is the recommendation to have investments and to promote clean energy. With respect to fighting corruption, we propose to have digital open platforms which will allow for oversight of governments and public agencies. Young people recommend transparency mechanisms with respect to financing of political parties. We should have honest political campaigns and free elections. Digital transformation is a pending challenge, and we propose telecommunications infrastructure targeting rural and Afro-descendant peoples to overcome the digital divide. Equality and inclusiveness is one of our main challenges in the region. In that case, we reiterate that we must have a non-discrimination approach and that we must include people with disabilities, people who are indigenous, who belong to the LGBTQI plus segment of our population. I would also like to mention two issues that are dear to my heart and that we spoke about. One has to do with strengthening democracy. We propose new methods and targeted actions which would reduce inequalities and strengthen democracy. We must strengthen political arenas so that young people can also participate and not just have us be consulted. Another issue, migration. We need to have effective methods to be able to include migrants in the countries of transit and reception. Before this, or behind this platform, behind these figures, there are real people, representatives. We have 27,000 contributions that young people make, and we hope you will keep those in mind. Thank you. We now have the Afro-Descendant Coalition of the Americas, represented by Rosa Maria Castro Salinas from the organization Afro-America 21st Century. Ms. Castro, you have the floor. Honorable representatives of the Organization of American States, members of civil society, and the business sector. On behalf of the Coalition of Persons of African Descent in the Americas, we present once again, we are gathered here concerned because we observe the decline of nationwide arenas that serve our population, especially women, young people, older adults, LGBTIQ+, those who are in mobility. Actions we believe are urgent and necessary to face the processes of stereotyping, profiling, and limited opportunities we are facing. We highlight the need to improve statistical data on Afro-descendant peoples in a disaggregated manner. We reiterate that this data must be included in administrative data to have real, updated, and detailed information. In addition, this must be taken into account to generate real investment in communities which, as a result of COVID, continue to be neglected. It is important to understand that investing in our communities and people will lead to real progress. We are concerned about the living conditions of Dominican Haitians who are stateless because they are not Haitian citizens because they were born and are culturally Dominican citizens. But these people have been abandoned, and this is allowing for modern slavery. It is a shame that after 10 years of approval, after the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and related form of intolerance, that only 6 countries in the region have ratified it. And of these 6, only 1 is from CARICOM. After the Plan of Action for the Decade for People of African Descent in the Americas, states have not really followed up on its objectives. Thus, we recommend the signing, ratification, and effective implementation of the Inter-American Convention Against Racism. a high-level meeting to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the approval of said convention. Create a work group to follow up on the objectives and activities set out in the Plan of Action for the Decade for People of African Descent in the Americas. Creation of a fund for economic development of people of African descent that responds to our realities and intersectionalities. We require the inclusion of ethnic racial variable in the administrative data collected.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Ms. Salinas. We now have Ms. Susan Bridgewater. She is from Women's Way Foundation on behalf of the LGBTTI+ Coalition. Ms. Bridgewater, you have the floor.
Thank you, everyone. States must assume their responsibility for implementing the treaties they have ratified and comply with the measures and judgments of the Inter-American Human Rights System. We call on all states to adopt the Advisory Opinion 2417 of the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights, both in terms of legal recognition and gender identity, in relation to marriage and families formed by LGBT persons. We celebrate some advancements in human rights, such as the decriminalization of consensual same-sex relations in Barbados, and that some states have explicitly prohibited the torture practices known as conversion therapies. We urge states to repeal laws and judicial practices that criminalizes people living with HIV, that violate their rights and will not quell this epidemic. We demand that states adopt the necessary measures to guarantee economic, social, cultural, environmental rights of LGBT people, include specific allocation of budget lines and compilation of disaggregated data on our living conditions in their statistics. The number of LGBT people in a situation of human mobility increased daily due to poverty, violence, prejudice, and the various catastrophes caused by climate change. We urge states to adopt a right-based approach to address hemisphere human mobility crisis. We are alarmed by the advance of conservative forces. Hate speech translates into increased violence against stigmatized groups. We especially request protection for human rights defenders and support and create space, if not, in order to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We now have the intervention of Malia Villarreal Lozano. She is from the Civil Association Brazos y Lazos and spokesperson for the Coalition for Social Progress. You have the floor, madam. Authorities, esteemed colleagues, with respect to my coalition, we are participating in this meeting. However, we know that many could not participate here because of financial restrictions. There are differences of opinion with respect to progressive issues, the right to life, self-perception, trans children. However, the debate, some want to silence it because of hate speech, which is homophobic and stigmatizing. This is used to discredit other people's ideas. There is persecution of freedom of expression. And we even see the state criminalizing it. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights since 1948 provides in Article 19 that all persons have the right to freedom of expression and opinion, and this right includes to not be bothered because of their opinions. In Mexico, there are several cases. We would point out that Teresa Castel, the Electoral Tribunal of the Federation, said that she had participated in political violence and was punished because of this. A law created to protect women. This was used to actually attack a woman. And what we see is that actually efforts are made to keep women out of legislatures, and we see religious organizations also trying to stop people from expressing their sexual orientation, prohibiting people from being involved in religion. We would remind the OAS that the right to religion and freedom of religion are inalienable rights.
Muy bien.
Very well. I now invite Ms. Maria Emilia Gomez from the Building a New World Foundation, who, in her capacity as spokesperson, will be representing the Building New Horizons Coalition. Ms. Gomez, you have the floor. Thank you. The coalition Building New Horizons are participating and protesting as we are in this dialogue because there were people who were not allowed to have access. They fulfilled all of the administrative responsibilities and spent a great deal of money, but they were left outside this building. We demand that the OAS respects the youth and all people who believe in democracy and freedom. Esteemed delegations and members of civil society, the advancement of gender ideology has many grave implications for our countries. But one of the most alarming, given its generational character, is the concept of trans infancy. This is a term that has no scientific justification that says that a child has the ability to self-perceive themselves outside of their biological sex, and in virtue of that, make decisions about its sex change from an early age. The implications of this presumption are so profound that they will affect the rest of the life of that youth, which has been the case in many cases. This topic goes far beyond just changing a name or a gender identity in a birth certificate or official document. It is including the use of reconstructive surgeries and hormone treatments that are basically the mutilation of healthy organs and the irreversible character with permanent damage to children who are subject to these surgeries. In addition, there are laws that are seeking to take away the rights of parents to actually intervene in the situation. There are laws that are being passed that keep parents from even opining on such a fundamental and delicate issue, which is the identity of their own children. And that is established by biology. It is inconceivable that these kinds of initiatives are being presented that are not only directly against parental rights, but also the rights of children. A minor is not capable of deciding on a gender transition because they are not psychologically mature. and they are not physically mature either. We exhort the member states of this organization to take actions to defend children throughout the continent. Think of them. They are our future, but also they are our present. We must let children be children. We must not indoctrinate them. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Very well. We kindly request, please. There we go. And we recognize that there's a context here of freedom of expression. So we are now going to hear from Elvira Constantina, Pablo Antonio, from the Iranu Collective, a network of young indigenous women, as spokesperson for the Coalition of the Human Rights of Adolescents and Youth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ms. Pablo, you have the floor. Organizations that are part of this coalition recognize the great debt that democracy as a political system has for the inequalities in the region and to ensure that people, especially youth, have access to their human rights. We know that democracy is built each day with an organized society that demands its rights, but that is impossible when we live in conditions of discrimination, inequality, and violence. For example, the removal of Peru's president in 2022, and we have seen similar situations in Chile and Peru. And there has been police violence. And we see that in the region there is a generalized discontent regarding the many systems of oppression that we face, but also because Latin American governments have not been able to eradicate the consequences of decades of corruption, violations of human rights, and abuses. The numbers speak for themselves. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there were approximately 200 million people living in poverty in 2022. In February of 2023, the government of Nicaragua forced more than 222 people to go into forced exile, and it also kicked out 300 people, including human rights defenders. In Peru, at least 49 people have died because of state repression since in December, when the different generalized strikes and manifestations began. And we know that there have been at least 13 journalists that have been killed based on data from the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. 273 people who have been killed are trans, and we have seen this between 2021 and 2022. Given the violence and inequality that we live in, we demand a democracy that goes beyond parties, ideologies, and government structures. We demand a democracy that is built by the citizens and a recognition of the rights of the people, and also to have anti-racism, anti-colonialist, anti-patriarchy situations that can ensure that the diversity of populations can live in justice and well-being. In this regard, to have a true democracy, it is required that the states ensure that human rights be respected and citizens be allowed to participate together and to create policies and plans to address structural inequality and ensure the implementation of these policies. In addition, civil society that is both feminist and in favor of human rights must participate in strengthening of democracy, and there can be no more backsliding with their participation in different fora. Thank you so much. Following our list, we will now hear from Rosa Maria Paya Acevedo from the Foundation for Pan-American Democracy, representing the Coalition for Democracy, Liberty, Justice, and political renewal. Ms. Paya, you have the floor. Good morning. Democracy and respect for human rights is continuing to be eroded in our country. We are seeing human suffering as a result, with only 1,500 political prisoners in Latin America alone, including numbers Mireillenis Benitez in Venezuela, Monser Redondo Alvarez in Nicaragua, and former president in Bolivia. We denounce the Cuban dictatorship for its involvement in many of these countries. They are killing and persecuting human rights defenders. For example, the example of Oswaldo Paya determined that the Cuban government was responsible for the death of my father. The exportation of Cuban ways of governance are seen, and this has been seen in reports of the United Nations. We denounce the practice of the persecution of political exiles, the violations of human rights in Nicaragua and Cuba, but also in Venezuela. These are real, and they are not just a simple narrative. As President Lula said, we exhort Brazil to defend democracy. The states of the Americas must come together against dictators. We also recognize the 9th Summit of the Americas and the importance of denouncing 3 dictatorships: to 1, eliminate all forms of violence, political violence, and the immediate freedom of all political prisoners in all countries; 2, to denounce state-sponsored terrorism, crimes against humanity, and demand that Cuba adopt the Declaration of Human Rights in the Americas. And also, Haiti must be addressed. 4, Mexico must stop its narratives that are going against the autonomy of election authorities. 5, use all available tools, including the Inter-American Treaty on Reciprocal Assistance, to stop the financing that is being provided by Cuba in the region, as established by the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Dictatorships only respond to pressure from the OAS, from other states, and the OAS has the responsibility to defend the right to democracy for all of our peoples. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Paya. We now continue with the presentation of Ms. Omaira Alvarez Frica of Youth with a Mission, who will speak as spokesperson for the coalition Opportunities for Contemporary Social Order. Ms. Alvarez, you have the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. The Coalition for the Contemporary Social Order participates under protest in this dialogue with the OAS because access has been denied to those who have made a financial effort and they were left outside of this building. We lament the inability of the OAS to treat with respect those who believe in democracy and freedom. The Organization of American States should guarantee and safeguard these rights. They are universal, inalienable, and unrenounceable, and indivisible, and they begin with the right to life. Today, the behavior of this multilateral organization is unrecognizable when it comes to the purposes that were its origin. I'm referring to the case of Beatriz against El Salvador in March of this year. It is an emblematic case because the experts that gave testimony there that were presented by the commission are simply surprising because they did not recognize Leilani. They called her product. They made her a thing, dehumanizing her and not allowing her to have an identity, even when her mother gave her a name in the civil registry. Beatriz was not the person who brought the case. She died in a car accident many years later. Her name, her case is used in a distortionary way, and we demand that this assembly categorically that it show respect for its charter and ratify the right to life from conception as established in Article 4 of the American Charter of Human Rights. It is not appropriate to have in the basic documents of the organization a declaration that is the inter-American system practically ignores. To refuse life of a person is the greatest act of discrimination and inequality that could exist. All person who is conceived has a right to live, and to deny the right to life is to take away all other human rights. So it may be that this is not a message that is as progressive as it should be or politically correct. And perhaps it may not be of great importance to some people, but if we want to build a society that goes against inequality and non-discrimination, the first thing that we must defend is that we all have a right to live. Thank you very much.
Muy bien. Muy bien.
Very well, and we will now continue with a presentation by Maria Teresa Blandón from the Women's Association Nuestra Voz, who will speak on behalf of the Coalition of Women's Human Rights in the Americas. Ms. Blandón, the floor is yours. The organizations that make up the Coalition for Human Rights of Women of the Americas exhort the member states of the General Assembly of the OAS to prioritize public policies to adopt as soon as possible guarantees to exercise human rights of women, youth, and girls without any limitation. To have a democratic culture, states must respect the autonomy of women's right to live free of violence, access to sexual and reproductive health services, including integral education, anti-conception, and also access to safe abortion. The case Beatriz presented to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is a clear example of the impact that the absolute penalization of abortion has on women's lives. In recent years, many young women become pregnant in their teenage years because of rape. And the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls has emphasized the responsibility of the states to ensure that the legal and systems ensure that sexual violence is recognized and that women have right to recourse. In 2022 and 2023, more than 716 femicides were committed in El Salvador, Argentina, Ecuador, and Colombia. Women in Peru that are disabled are forced to face constant discrimination, and this can have an effect on their full development and that of their communities. Sexual workers are discriminated in public services, health services, and it limits their intimacy, sexual intimacy, and their autonomy. And they do not have access to those rights. They have threats, attacks, criminalization, forced displacement, and murder. In 2022, there were at least 4,803 aggressions in Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, including 20 murders. The states are the main perpetrators of these aggressions. The return of authoritarian governments in Central America only deepens the systematic violation of human rights. It attacks freedom of expression, and it closes this public square, which is key to move forward with democracy. Millions of women and girls in all of their diversity demand the opportunity to live in a truly democratic society.
Bien. Invitamos ahora al señor Luis Antonio Martínez Guzmán, de Human Life International, a tomar la palabra en representación de la Coalición para el Desarrollo Humano. Señor Martínez, lo escuchamos.
No es un proceso que se pueda imponer desde arriba.
And this is a process that cannot be imposed from above. People and democracies are consolidated when we work together for a joint goal. These links begin when a woman gives a life to a new human being in her womb. We recognize that this continues in the lap of parents and in the home. And this becomes the dream of peoples. We recognize the links of a family, and to consider this as a regressive major, this is a democracy that is devoid of meaning. We know that we recognize that no democracy could not exist without the people, and what people could strengthen without the family. Secondly, the Coalition for Human Development. We affirm the fundamental dignity of all people from the moment of conception to their natural death. These inherent rights are the oxygen of an organization based on democracy. Affirming human dignity is to conscientiously recognize that we must stop calling someone a person who is disabled, but rather a person with a disability. We recognize that this is something of importance to all excluded groups. We must recognize that all relationships must be focused on dignity and love. Affirming dignity is affirming that a conceived being is a person and has his or her own life, even when that person is still in prenatal development, or if someone believes they have sufficient reason to exclude that person. We know that democracy must ensure that this is recognized. We must recognize that there is something in common between slavery in America, apartheid, and the Holocaust. There were supremacies that put people above others and said some were more valuable than others. Now, we wrap up simply saying that we would ask you to vote for Estuardo Ragón and Pierre Pigozzi for the IACHR, because we must recognize that an adversarial approach must end. We must recognize that we have a common ideal. This is what the Americas deserve. We recognize that our democracy must have deeper roots, and it starts with the family and the dignity of all people from the moment of conception. May God bless America.
Muy bien.
Very well. I will now give the floor to Gloria Margarita Cano Legua of the Pro-Human Rights Association, APRODE, who will present the points of the Coalition of Human Rights Organizations of the Americas. Ms. Cano, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, good morning. From the Coalition of Human Rights Organizations of the Americas, we express our concern on 3 items. First, the continued deterioration of democratic institutions and its impact on human rights in OAS member states, in particular, the weakening of the role of the judicial powers to protect constitutionality and human rights, the attacks on electoral systems, and the separation of powers, as shown the recent crisis in Peru, where the excessive use of force has led to dozens of victims and many, many people injured. We recognize the grave situation in Guatemala as well, and we also alert on the reduction of guarantees for free and fair elections in that country. Second, we express our concern for the persecution of members of civil society, the repression of protests in many countries, including Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, and Ecuador. And the persons who defend the environment are particularly affected, and sexual and reproductive rights, women's rights, youth rights, LGBTI+, and indigenous leaders who are still victims of attacks, threats, spying, and disinformation campaigns, stigmatization, criminalization, and forced displacement, among others. And in Nicaragua, even some people have lost their nationality. In this context, we call upon the member states to ratify the Escazú Protocol, and that they defend rights, that they investigate these threats, and that they punish those who carry them out. Third, we encourage states to reaffirm their commitment to the effective functioning of the Inter-American system, committing to internal domestic systems that ensure that the principles of the Inter-American system are covered, and that the people who are part of the Inter-American system's organs are of a high moral character, and that they ensure geographic balanced representation with gender parity. And these candidates should not be included if they do not fulfill these requirements. Finally, we have profound concern over the limitation of civil society in OAS fora. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Now, to conclude this segment, we will hear from Maria Camila Ospina of Nueva Democracia, New Democracy, a spokesperson of the Youth and Freedom Coalition. Ms. Ospina, you have the floor. Good morning. I am here today representing 70,000 youth that have signed the Declaration of Youth. For several years, but more recently, we have seen how the Inter-American System for Protection of Human Rights has been completely losing its purpose and its nature. It was created by the member states to fulfill an important role to ensure the protection of human rights and our fundamental rights. It has slowly become an NGO that has been financed by special interests, and it has a particular ideology and that discriminates against the vast majority of the population of the Americas. In a region that has the highest levels of hunger and violence, among others, this system is promoting a progressive agenda and persecuting religious groups with under the excuse or the guise of non-discrimination. And they are constantly silencing any dissident voice, especially as the case with Edgar Ralón, where we could see that clearly there was a partial decision in the case of Beatriz against El Salvador in favor of abortion, or in Chile where there was a ruling against religious freedom. We shouldn't be surprised by this when the General Assembly of the OAS is convened about promoting and protecting human rights. And we haven't even decided what a human is or what a human right is. And we are on quicksand. And we recognize that everything has become relative and that individual rights have no limits, so the system has moved into a very dangerous position. It makes women invisible, and what we have done, they use the innocence of children to be able to forward their agenda. And they go against those who have not been born, those who are conceived but have not been born yet. And that is the case of Beatriz v. El Salvador. And we must recognize people should be able to express their convictions, and that you have turned that into a clear violation and shown a intolerance without limits. And ambassadors, to subject people's dignity and their ability to exercise human rights based on the convenience of certain groups is anti-democratic in its essence. And we recognize that we all have a right simply because we are human beings. We do not want to have unfounded excuses.
Muy bien.
Very good.
Bien. Se agradece.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now going to give the floor to the representatives of member states for their remarks. I have a footnote. I beg the member states, Chile, El Salvador, Bolivia, Peru, that you seek to make your message concise, because that way we can make some headway in our agenda. Chile, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the state of Chile, we'd like to thank civil society for their work throughout the Americas. And we have a conviction, in the words of our president, President Boric, problems of democracy, which are multiple, need to be dealt with. And plural work is a democratic undertaking, the work of civil society. And we underscore plural because society needs a rich democracy. Well, there are different kinds of organizations that may or may not agree with the political stance of the administration. And we see that in Chilean society based on our social and political crisis, which dates from October 2019, which led to our Constituent Assembly. And I'm not just talking about the referendum, which has been in the news and which we are known for, but also arenas for citizen participation, hearings, consultations, assemblies, halls, and other kinds of dialogue. And this is how we can express our freedom under our Constitution, where we can talk about different issues, for example, conversations with trade unions about wages and other issues, support for SMEs, the business dialogue, talk about the importance of this, and trade union organizations, which are also very important. These are social and political actors which can help us build a new social compact. Issues like minimum wage, which should be guaranteed to workers for their work. We also are trying to infuse this in our foreign policy. Our foreign ministry is very active in including civil society in the universal system of human rights and others. We are furthering candidacies, as pointed out by the Human Rights Organization. Of course, it's not enough. We need to think about how to do this better. How can we learn from different perspectives, different positions? Reducing the public square is something that really worries us in and of itself and in its impact on people. If we have a smaller public square, then we have less diversity. But this problem doesn't end there, because this has an impact on people's daily lives. I would like to reiterate what I said before. If we didn't have the trade union movement, we wouldn't have decent wages. If we didn't have environmentalists, we would not have any awareness about climate change. And to the extent civil society is active, we can mitigate and adapt to new circumstances like climate change. The issue of human rights, which is so important for Chile. Well, we can discuss this here at this multilateral organization, but without civil society, we have a weakening of human rights, especially when we refer to historically excluded groups, women, young people, Afro-descendant peoples, indigenous peoples, and others. It's important that we learn from each other, that we listen to each other, and based on this conviction, we would like to congratulate the OAS and its organ that has or is charged with relationship with civil society, because they do a great job with very little. And thank you very much. Thank you, Chile. El Salvador has the floor. Chair, my delegation would like to greet civil society organizations who are here with us and are online and have raised different issues here with us and have allowed us to know their perspectives. From the beginning of Nayib Bukele's administration, we have transformed our nation based on Salvadoran people's well-being and targeting the fight against criminality, which for decades brought pain and suffering to our people and leading us to be desperate and sad. The measures against criminality have led to peace and security, and this is allowing us to overcome the challenge of gangs, and this has had a positive impact on our neighbors. Last year was the safest in El Salvador's history, and we hope to be the safest country in the Americas. The disproportionate power of those gangs that existed, and this led to our Congress approving a exceptional regime, but which is based on our Constitution. This exceptional regime, which is like a state of emergency, has led to a renewal of social and economic life. Today, for the first time in decades, we are safeguarding the life of our people. We see a inversion of our statistics on crime, the significant reduction in extortion, as well as recovery of public squares, allows for the government to fully comply with its duty to provide basic health, housing, and education services nationwide. With regard to the criminal justice system, reforms have been approved to protect victims and majority of our people, in keeping with respect for human rights and our Constitution. The achievements of my government with respect to security go beyond just fighting crime. We have made unprecedented public investments to have an effective methodology to lead to well-being for young people and children. In the office of Gabriel Bukele, our First Lady, we have a program for the development of children so that there can be high-quality health care, nutrition, education, learning, and care through the law Let's Grow Together. El Salvador, in keeping with this effort, recognizes the right to life from conception. We likewise recognize the obligation of the state, society, and family to ensure girls, boys, and young people a dignified life, integral and inclusive and non-discriminatory development, in other areas. For the first time in our Republican history, we have been able to actually emphasize education and devote more than 5% of our national budget to education, which will allow our boys, girls, and young peoples to have the tools to address the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. We have proposed innovations to bring our country in line with universal standards with respect to health, digital transformation, promotion of tourism, protection of the environment. With these measures, El Salvador and its people are enjoying their rights that were denied for decades. Investment in education, justice, security, the environment, and others. This is bringing about a state of well-being, which is the priority goal of the Bukele administration. In order to lay the foundations for progress in El Salvador and allow for prosperity in the future. We will not rest until we restore public order, justice, and security for all people in El Salvador. All efforts are undertaken in keeping with our Constitution and also in keeping with the decision of our people through their representatives. The destiny of El Salvador is in the hands of our citizens, and that's why we are working so hard. Jointly, we will continue to strengthen democratic institutions, the fight against corruption, to be able to strengthen the rule of law in El Salvador, and also to keep the peace, which has been so difficult to achieve. Thank you. Thank you. Bolivia has the floor. Peru, then the Dominican Republic. We are going to close with those countries because if not, we will run out of time. Good morning. Thank you, Chair. We greet the representatives of all delegations here, as well as the representatives of civil society organizations and other social actors. For us, Bolivia, it is important that the General Assembly begins with a dialogue with key actors in our region, and this allows us to have a frank dialogue. For us, the participation of our people, civil society, is key. This shows the sovereignty of states and allows us to have valuable exchanges. States must recognize the plurality and diversity of civil society as an autonomous and independent subject, and we must ensure their political participation and create arenas so they can have a real, legitimate, and impartial participation. Bolivia is a plurinational state, and we appreciate civil society. In Bolivia, social organizations, which are from our different sectors, participate under the Constitution or in keeping with the Constitution in political life and social life. The voices of our peoples must be heard, and we must allow for their contributions to reach different levels here in the OAS as well, so that we can respond to the needs of society. We should not adopt biased stances. Rather, we must be impartial in this regard. We believe that this dialogue will help us understand better the role of civil society and their fundamental role in the development of our people and the mechanisms of the OAS. Bolivia will continue to foster the involvement of civil society organizations in multilateral organizations so that the reflections and concerns of civil society are heard. This is very important because the states are facing many crises that are threatening our peaceful coexistence, especially that of vulnerable peoples. So we are willing and open to hear this diversity of opinions. Thank you so much. Peru, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair of the Permanent Council, esteemed delegates and representatives of civil society. First of all, at this dialogue with civil society, I want to underscore that in the framework after the coup d'etat of the ex-president Pedro Castillo, the different organs have acted in keeping with their legal duties under the Constitution to investigate this incident. Secondly, I want to refer to Peru's commitment to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. These are framed in our constitutions, our guidelines, and international instruments to which we are party. Peru, since 2002, has an open invitation to independent experts of the Council of Human Rights of the UN for them to visit and evaluate human rights in the country in keeping with the Council's mandate. At a hemispheric level, Peru is part of the Inter-American system made up by the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court. And it has a policy to respect these organs and to comply with their judgments. During visits of experts to Peru, Peru has opened up its doors in order to allow for contacts with all powers of the state, private sector, public sector, and also civil society organizations. Currently, with the support of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN, we are identifying priority areas to be able to create capacity in the public sector by increasing cooperation and technical assistance. Civil society will have its corresponding arenas to be able to communicate with the state. Thank you very much. The Dominican Republic has the floor. Thank you, Chair. First of all, we want to greet all representatives of civil society and thank them for sharing their recommendations and perspectives with us at this important occasion. We have asked for the floor to say that the relationship between Haiti and the Dominican Republic is a priority of the Dominican Republic, led up by President Luis Abinader. Now, when we refer to migration, the Dominican Republic wants a responsible policy that is coherent, consistent with respect for human rights and respect for everyone. Although taking into account some people do violate our migratory laws. Now, with respect to Haiti and others, we have 4 pillars with respect to policy: efficiency, with respect to coming in and out of our territory, an integral framework for migration, which ensures governance, and a framework where the country can protect its territory and sovereignty, and also strict compliance with laws on migration. The economic, social, and political crisis in Haiti demands immediate attention from the international community. The Dominican Republic has reiterated many times that the international community needs to act, and we have said so at the UN and here at the OAS. There needs to be solutions. Most countries in the region who have been affected by this crisis, like ours, we have taken measures to defend our national security and making the international community aware that they should not leave Haiti alone. This crisis has gone on for many years, and it's having an impact throughout the hemisphere, in some countries more than in others. But to date, Haiti and its people have not received sufficient support to be able to get back on a path to stability and development. Thank you.
Muy bien, vamos a...
Very well. We now have several interventions from civil society representatives and social actors. We now have Mr. Asdrúbal Dubón Benfeld from the organization El Refugio de la Niñez. He will represent the observations and recommendations of the Coalition for Human Mobility in the Americas. Mr. Dubón, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair. Delegations in representation of human mobility in the Americas, we are concerned about migrants, asylum seekers, people who are internally displaced, and others who are vulnerable because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnic origin. So we would request that states comply with their obligations under human rights instruments, and also this includes the Cartagena Declaration, and to not sign bilateral, multilateral agreements that fly in the face of these international instruments. All people have the right to leave their countries, to look for a better way of life. We need for states to facilitate migration, ensuring the right to non-refoulement, to not be expelled at the border. There are an increasing number of people who need protection in the Americas. So we need to take measures to strengthen national refugee systems in keeping with inter-American and universal standards from an intersectional perspective. We must guarantee the rights of migrants. We should not have restrictive policies at the border which undermine the rights of asylum seekers, especially when we refer to women, young people, LGBTQI people, and Afro-descendant peoples. They are the main victims of the criminal networks that traffic people and who even perpetrate sexual violence and kill people. Young people and migrants who have been victims of serious human rights violations need to be helped. We request progress in regional coordinated responses from the guarantee of human rights and the principle of co-responsibilities among states, ensuring mechanisms for the active participation of civil society, migrant organization, and other allies. This context requires the states consider the preparation of a convention on human mobility in the Americas and to take advantage of the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Cartagena Declaration and have a better response to the causes and challenges of the growing forced migration we see in the continent. Thank you. We will now hear from Nicolás Panotto of the Multidisciplinary Study Group on Religion and Public Advocacy. He represents the Coalition of Religions, Beliefs, and Spiritualities in Dialogue with Civil Society. Mr. Panotto, you have the floor. Dear representatives of permanent missions and civil society, in keeping with the framework of the motto that convenes this dialogue, as a coalition, we question the role and contribution of religions and spiritualities in a democratic society. These elements represent a debt within the religious field. In our region, there are discourses and practices that discriminate against people who belong to religious minorities, while there are frameworks that benefit majority religions. Also, we have religious groups that actually are undermining democracy. For example, we see that they are promoting hate speech, or they try to participate from a privileged position in debates. However, we have many groups, religious and spiritual, that contribute positively to democracy and advocate for respect and an exchange of ideas. So we urge you to consider the following: that there is cooperation, exchange, and dialogue with a diversity of religious and spiritual groups. This will help to allow us to hear other voices, and we can hear from all the rich groups. This will also allow us to hear the demands of women, LGBTQ plus community, youth, etc. We insist that the resolution on freedom of religion is a tool that can help us have a broader debate that includes more voices, and it will allow us to further the right to religion. Third, we believe states have a lot to do to improve the relationship between religion and democracy. There needs to be cooperation that allow for different religious perspectives so that we don't always hear the same voices. We need more secularism to have this bridge between society and spiritualities. We need to ensure that religious freedom is not weaponized, rather that this allows for the growth of beliefs and spiritualities for common good. Finally, we need educational and training spaces to stop being co-opted to promote specific agendas. Rather, they need to embrace an intersectional and intercultural, interreligious perspective. Thank you.
Muy bien. Invito a la...
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Donna da Costa Martinez from the organization Honduras Against AIDS to take the floor in her capacity as spokesperson for sexual and reproductive rights. You have the floor, madam.
Member States, colleagues from civil society. This coalition wishes to urge the Member States to promote and protect equality and human rights, as well as the dignity of all people without any distinction, exclusion, or discrimination. Sexual and reproductive rights is a significant aspect of human rights. Strengthening a culture of democratic responsibility implies respecting, promoting, and guaranteeing these rights. Sadly, however, there is a large gap in the region between the letter of the law and its implementation. In LAC, high prevalence rates of violence, including sexual violence, experienced by women from their partners throughout their lives vary by country, but always in times of pandemic. Latin America and the Caribbean rank second among the world regions for its adolescent pregnancy rate. Every year in the region, 5 out of every 100 pregnancies occur in children under 20 years of age, many as a result of rape, and 2 million children are born to young mothers between the ages of 15 and 19. The Dominican Republic and Guyana have the highest rates of unintended teenage pregnancies in the Caribbean, whilst Bolivia and Venezuela have the highest rates in South America. In most countries of the Caribbean, the age of consent is 16, yet the Caribbean context is marked by early sexual debut with a mean age of 14 years for the first sexual encounter. Navigating access to sexual and reproductive health services is a major hindrance for sexually active young persons, along with legal barriers and sociocultural barriers, produce a judgment-laden and shame-based environment. 1 in 4 girls is forced to marry or establish an early union on this continent. Girls and women in all their diversities are most impacted by poverty. Although many Caribbean countries have frameworks for health and family life education, there are concerns regarding the quality and content, as well as the level of implementation of these curricula, as they do not sufficiently address the need for comprehensive sexuality education. On the other hand, in the countries of the Americas, where there are regulations on CSE, it does not reach every girl and adolescent. Our region bears the shame and pain of deaths from unsafe abortions that have destroyed the lives of women and their families. Unsafe abortion continues to be a serious public health concern in most countries. Antigua and Barbuda, Aruba, Curacao, Dominica, Haiti, United States, Ecuador, Brazil, Peru, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Martin, Trinidad and Tobago have
Thank you. Moving forward with our agenda, we now invite Rodrigo Ivan Cortés Jiménez from Tlaloc, Tlacash Civil Association to present the speech of the Coalition for Freedom of Conscience and Expression. Mr. Cortés, the floor is yours. The horizon of liberties is gravely restricted in countries like Cuba and Venezuela, but more recently in countries like Mexico and Nicaragua. I'm Rodrigo Ivan Cortés, and I am addressing you on behalf of the Coalition of Freedom of Conscience and Expression. We denounce before this assembly that the hate speech in reality is being used to cancel a discourse that others hate, and they're doing it in Mexico in legislation and also in the legal system, where the press is being silenced and they're being threatened, like Sergio Zaragoza, who has been threatened for having a disagreement with the members of the current administration when it comes to protecting life. And parliamentary immunity is being eliminated for the opposition, the case of Gabriel Cuadri and Teresa Castel, to try to defend children and women using, in fact, laws that supposedly are there to defend women and are being reinterpreted by the courts to justify violence against women. And the freedom of expression is being canceled, and their free participation is being limited in the democratic creation of laws. And this, unfortunately, I am suffering myself in the cases that are being held against me and the National Front for the Family, because supposedly we have violated human rights promoted by politicians of the current administration to protect so-called sexual and reproductive rights and the ideology of gender confusion and destroying democracy. In Nicaragua, we are seeing a systematic violation of the right to religious freedom against the Catholic Church, where the ministers have been jailed and been condemned for absurd accusations, which is the case of Bishop Alvarez, as well as orders from of Mother Teresa of Calcutta have been closed. Other education installations have been shut down, as well as bank accounts of the Catholic Church, and limited their ability to have processions during Holy Week. We recognize that freedom of expression is key for democracy, and this must be canceled. This is something that must not continue. Thank you. I now give the floor to the Coalition for the Rights of Sex Workers, which will be represented by Ms. Maria Lucila Esquivel from the Association of Women Sex Workers of Paraguay, United in Hope. We give you the floor, Ms. Esquivel. We want to bring to this assembly the discussion on the situation of people who are sex workers in Latin America and the Caribbean. We know that none of the countries of Latin America actually punish sexual work, and only some countries in the English-speaking Caribbean have laws that criminalize this. There are some countries that give formal recognition to sex work in legislation, like different police or municipal regulations. Justice systems of some countries, like Colombia, have said categorically that they demand the rest of the state to respect our rights. Nevertheless, people who exercise sex work are still being arbitrarily and illegally and detained and discriminated in all countries without exception. The Latin American Caribbean network of sex workers has more than 2,500 cases of human rights violations in 15 countries that show how institutions continue to violate our rights without any legal basis and with impunity, especially the security forces, but also health systems and justice systems and labor systems. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued consultative opinion 2721, and the court establishes that the states have the responsibility to adjust their legislation to respect the labor rights of all people without discrimination. It also establishes that the states should take measures to facilitate the transition of stigmatized groups to the formal economy so that discrimination is not an obstacle to the exercise of their rights, including explicitly in these groups women who are sex workers. This lack of regulation on behalf of the states for sex work, it also violates international instruments like the International Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Treaty, as well as the Protocol of San Salvador and the Belém do Pará Convention for the Inter-American System. The first step, the solution of all of the problems that have been mentioned, is the regulation of sex work like any other job. This assembly should repudiate the exercise of all violence by the states against people who are involved in sex work and demand that our rights be fully respected. Therefore, we demand the immediate creation of a special rapporteurship. Thank you. Next, I would invite Ms. Diana Carolina Rodriguez Ruiz from the Foundation Bendice al Prójimo, Bless Your Fellow Man, who will speak in her capacity as a spokesperson for the Ibero-American Evangelical Congress Coalition. Thank you, Chair. The Coalition, Ibero-American Evangelical Congress, participates in this dialogue with the OAS under protest, not only because civil society was not given access, but also because of the fact that the Secretary General is not even at this dialogue. Esteemed heads of delegation, religious freedom is one of the most violated rights. There is a list where Christians are persecuted. Colombia and Mexico are the two countries that have the most extreme persecution this year. Death, as well as discrimination and other poor treatment is something that they have had to see. In our Latin American countries, we have seen in a permanent way those who are at the head of the state have engaged in social lynching because religious people think differently than other sectors like progressivist sectors. One example was Luis Ernesto Vargas, the OAS Colombian representative to the OAS, where he expressed hate and he said that religion is hurting society, and that is unjust and untrue. We have been in this continent for more than 2 centuries, and we have sought peace, respect, and worked to protect the most vulnerable populations of our countries. This is why in education and protection of children and youth, we are working with people who are affected by drug addiction and alcoholism. This is why we recognize the importance of recognizing religious freedom, and we must respect the different worldviews that we have, and we must be valued and respected in all areas of society. We cannot forget. Now, we must ensure peaceful coexistence among peoples and individual liberties, but more than anything, the possibility that the entire continent can give opportunities to future generations. Religious leaders have been rejected simply because they do not agree with the ideas that prevail in many countries, as is happening in Mexico and Colombia. Please, please protect our continent. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Thank you. Very well. We will now hear from Beatriz Borges from the Center for Justice and Peace, CEPAS, on behalf of the Coalition for an Inter-American Laboratory for Political and Social Innovation. Ms. Borges, go ahead. Good morning, good afternoon. Delegates, representatives, we come to you with urgency and determination on behalf of the Coalition for an Inter-American Laboratory for Political and Social Innovation at a critical time for democracy in the region, but especially for my country, Venezuela, where we demand that the international community has a firm commitment with the reinstitutionalization of democracy in our country. It is crucial that there be a multilateral coordinated effort to ensure human rights, promote justice, and build peace from a point of view of transparency and innovation, where we can have multi-sectoral approaches. We are concerned as we hear the speeches and affirmations that are beginning to find echo throughout the region that is talking about normalization and pacification of the situation in Venezuela. This is why we request that the member states, when they establish cooperation and communication mechanisms with those who are in power in Venezuela, that they demand that they fulfill their international obligations when it comes to human rights and the implementation of the recommendations established in the reports of international organizations for protection that have been produced in the Inter-American system and the United Nations. We need a strategy that has human rights at its center, that is anchored on following these recommendations as binding responsibilities of the Venezuelan authorities. This not only avoids the manipulation of narratives and polarizing discussions, but it offers a true way to have effective implementation to remove Venezuela from the many crises that keep people suffering. In this regard, any support for dialogue and negotiation should have an appropriate characterization of the conflict and using international standards of human rights. Only thus will we be able to achieve a way out of these crises in Venezuela. We must be dedicated to the reintroduction of democracy in Venezuela, and we must have independent investigations and true judicial processes against those who have committed atrocities. And we must ensure that there is a right to political participation without discrimination, and that we have free and fair elections. And when we see that the public square is being limited and civil society must be involved to exercise democracy, this commitment must not leave by the wayside all of the conditions that Venezuelans are facing. Until these are addressed, Venezuelans will continue to leave the country. It is important to remember the protection of the majority.
Bien, mil disculpas.
You'll forgive me for having to cut you off. We now invite Manuel Acosta from the Global Center for Human Rights to take the floor on behalf of the Coalition for Access to Justice and the Rule of Law. Mr. Acosta, you have the floor. Excellencies, for this coalition, the defense of the rule of law is essential to access to true justice. This is why we consider it a priority for the organization and the institutions that comprise it to faithfully respect the obligations agreed upon by the states. These obligations not only give origin to them, but also establish their competencies, resulting in a functional framework that, when strictly observed, lends credibility to its decisions. To talk about human rights is to talk about the essential existence of human beings. And we recognize that this is unequalable. We recognize that a person must be able to protect his or her rights. The purpose of the American Convention was to enshrine these rights in order to establish a clear and unquestionable reference to inalienable rights for individuals. This legal framework exists not only to be respected by states and individuals, but also by the organizations and institutions responsible for upholding the convention. Namely, these rights must be respected by the OAS and the institutions, the IACHR and the court and the SIM. This system was established to recognize the rights that the treaties recognize and not create new rights. We see that the institutions have forgotten the legal framework that has been provided to them and has arbitrarily become instruments of ideological agendas that have nothing to do with the respect for the nature of the individual and their dignity. The emblematic case is in this performance of the IACHR is the case of Beatriz against El Salvador, where it disregarded the fact that there is a human being in the maternal womb. Would it be good if it answered? Is it not a human being? What is it? An animal? An object? Or what do you think? At what magical moment does it occur that that transforms into a human being? If an organ established to defend human rights is not able to recognize the moment when a human being exists, then the question is, what do you defend? Second, another one of the pillars of this organization is democracy. And this is something we find in the preamble, the importance of democracy. Democracy is not respected by the OAS, and it does not recognize the power given to the legitimate governments and representatives. In recent years, the IACHR and the court, in the pretext of establishing a supposed inter-American standards, unilaterally grant themselves binding effects that they seek to replace and substitute the democratically elected institutions. These should be respected. Thank you.
Muy bien. Invitamos a...
We would now invite the Coalition for an Inclusive Economy with Social Justice to take the floor through its spokesperson, Ms. Liliana Gutierrez Pamfilo of the Guadalupe Nájera Foundation. Ms. Gutierrez, we are ready to hear. Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. In the Coalition for an Inclusive Economy and Social Justice, we consider that to speak of democracy when there are so many inequalities is complex. From our point of view, fighting inequality begins with guaranteeing the right to a worthy job and understanding the reality of markets in Latin America and the Caribbean. This reality indicates that 1 of every 2 people works in an informal market. The informal economy is on 2 levels. First, self-employment, with someone going out and selling and engaging in commerce in the public square, and also precarious work with no social security and with significant regulational holes. In order to have decent work, as set forth in the development goals, Sustainable Development Goals, you must have a formal economy. So we therefore recommend that those laws, regulations, and criminal bans that control commerce in the public square. And we must create a necessary framework that establishes the requirements to move slowly from informality to formality. This, in order to ensure that there is a legal way to make a living and to support families and improve labor conditions and to abolish persecution and the criminalization of street vendors. And with a human rights-based point of view, improve economies in this hemisphere. That's all I have. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Clément Chartier, the Manitoba Métis Federation, to take the floor on behalf of the Coalition of Indigenous Nations and Organizations. Mr. Chartier, you have the floor.
As representatives of the Americas, we once again remind all delegations to the OAS General Assembly that the indigenous peoples of the Americas are completely distinct from civil society organizations. We would also like to remind everyone here today that the situation of indigenous peoples continues to worsen. Our leaders are criminalized. Our people suffer high rates of poverty. Mega projects pollute our sources of life, and consultation protocols continue to be ignored. Today, we will not repeat what we have been stating for decades. Today, we want to extend our thanks to the government of Guatemala, the OAS, and PAHO for the implementing part of the 2017 Plan of Action, which convened a meeting to explore a monitoring mechanism for the implementation of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Indigenous representatives in attendance at that workshop, while concerned about the potential outcome, reached a consensus with state delegations, which is a monitoring
and evaluation mechanism. We hope that this proposed mechanism will be approved by the General Assembly at this sitting. By moving forward with this proposed mechanism and with the proposed full engagement of the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, we can at least state that we are acting collectively to realize the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of the specific rights of Indigenous peoples as enshrined in the Declaration and the proposed mechanism for its realization. For us, the Declaration, the Plan of Action, and the proposed mechanism for monitoring the full and proactive implementation of the Declaration by governments are key to our success. We trust that the member states of the General Assembly here today will take a strong position.
Muy bien.
Very well. We will now give the floor to Hernando Cabezas Viveros from the Afro-descendant community of Santiago de Cali. He is taking the floor in representation of the Coalition for Afro-Descendant Communities. The floor is yours. Nestor Mendez, ASG, members of the General Assembly, we want to begin by celebrating and recognizing the launch of the peace process between the government of Gustavo Petro of Colombia and the ELN guerrilla to reach total peace in the country. 75 years after the foundation of the OAS, we have promises that have been unfulfilled. The Inter-American, or the Inter-American Democratic Charter and the American Charter on Human Rights talks of justice and peace and democracy. And many Afro-descendants are still excluded today and not able to be full citizens in the Americas. In July, we are going to celebrate 150 years of the finalization of the last vestige of slavery in the United States. Today, Afro-American populations, as well as Afro-descendant populations, are excluded and discriminated due to the persistence of systemic racism, racial discrimination, and other forms of discrimination. And here in this assembly, we have a smaller number of members who are here. They were not able to attend because they could not cover the cost of the trip, and in some cases where the states did not give importance or even recognize these organizations as civil society organizations, and they were not taken into account. The OAS also did not give relevance to members of the coalition to participate here in this stage for democracy. The Afro-descendant population in Americas is more than 200 million people, and they have limited access to services for education and health and good housing. And they are often excluded and discriminated against, and they are dealing with poverty and long-standing discrimination. This is why it is extremely important that the member states of the OAS promote the following: a economic development fund for Afro-descendant populations. There should be an organization representing Afro-descendants within the OAS, and the realization of a regional conference of the Americas against discrimination, racial discrimination, and racism, and establish a special envoy for Afro-descendant affairs in the Americas, and to create a commission for reparations for Afro-descendants. And we encourage the OAS General Assembly to reject hate, racism, and racial discrimination. And that made it difficult for Francia Marquez in my country.
Bien.
Very well. We have reached the end of this dialogue, and we thank all of you for your participation, for your observations, and your recommendations. The states present here today take note of that which you have shared, and we take this opportunity to reiterate our commitment, our significant commitment to civil society organizations, and we appreciate the efforts and the contributions that you have made today. I want you to know that all of us here value specifically each one of the interventions, comments, manifestations, feelings, emotions, and speeches. The only road that we are all on, we have a great deal of diversity, and we must all be committed to it. Thank you very much. Yes, Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you. I apologize for taking the floor at the last minute, but I think this is very important, and we would like to make a few comments. So I would like to express my thanks and gratitude to the representatives from civil society, coalitions for sharing their work and perspectives with us today. Canada is pleased to be part of this dialogue as we continue to learn from a range of organizations from across the hemisphere. For Canada, a free and thriving civil society is a backbone of a truly democratic society, enabling respectful dialogue and reflecting multitude of views and consideration. Civil society is an important source of information and insights, provides enlightened reflections that enrich policy development and helps keep governments accountable. Canada is concerned, however, by the erosion of civil society space, and the threats to the rights of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. According to Freedom House's 2023 report, freedom in the world has declined for the 17th consecutive year. This situation reflects a growing tendency for governments to limit civic space through repressive laws and regulations which unduly restrict civic freedoms. These may include anti-terrorism laws, public order laws, laws that stigmatize civil society groups as foreign agents, or laws that create bureaucratic obstacles to obtaining funding, particularly from foreign donors. In addition to formal measures to narrow civic space, informal measures against CSOs are also on the rise. In some countries, governments, their proxies, and conservative political groups target human rights defenders, environmentalists, women's rights groups, and 2S LGBTQI+ organizations, amongst other members of civil society. They threaten, misinform, and intimidate CSOs. We have seen and heard that while digital tools offer CSOs greater collaboration and growing their capacity, digital tools can conversely be used by state and non-state actors for illegal and/or repressive purposes. It is precisely at these times that we must fight disinformation and support an informed and engaged citizenry that can participate meaningfully in society both online and offline. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the valuable contribution you make to the Inter-American processes. Your experiences, perspectives, and ideas strengthen our policies and programs to achieve more and attain greater results for more peoples of the Americas. While Canada appreciates the voices of every group here, let me please recognize the participation of Indigenous peoples. Canada believes that the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and perspectives is critical to the work of the OAS and should inform the decisions that we take as an organization, including at the General Assembly. I would also like to recognize the participation of women's rights and feminist organizations. Overwhelming evidence shows that the advancement of gender equality, gender-responsive policies, and the empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity act as multipliers on all development goals. That is why their work is central in transforming ideas and practices towards a more pluralistic, prosperous, and sustainable society. I would like to express Canada's gratitude also 2S LGBTQI+ organizations who bring voice to historically marginalized groups and who work tirelessly to share and build a vision of an inclusive future. Further, we would like to extend our sincere thanks to all those organizations of journalists and human rights defenders who work incessantly to uphold freedom of expression and media independence. In these exceptional times, the work of journalists and other media workers serves to keep societies informed and to counter false or misleading information. We cannot allow concerns over disinformation to be used as a pretext for overly restrictive prohibitions on the public's access to information or the right to freedom of expression. As we discussed the narrowing of civic space, nowhere in the Americas has been such a dramatic change in recent years as Nicaragua. Canada reiterates its condemnation of the government of Nicaragua's repression of journalists, academics, and organizations. To the organizations and human rights defenders working tirelessly for the betterment of the people of Nicaragua, we commend you and thank you. Finally, Canada is deeply concerned with the ongoing migration crisis for Venezuela that has resulted in the largest displacement of refugees and migrants in the region. We applaud the efforts of civil society to amplify the voices of those that have been impacted by the situation and to support host countries in addressing the issue in a manner that respects the dignity of migrants. Canada will continue to play a leadership role in the promotion and protection of civil society, including through chairing the Community of Democracies Working Group on the Empowerment and Protection of Civil Society, and as founding member of the Coalition for Online Freedom. Canada is committed to working with civil society at all levels and supporting civic space. Civil society organizations and civic spaces are the foundation of an open, inclusive, and effective democracy. Thank you very much.
Muy bien. Ahora sí.
I don't have anyone else signed up to take the floor. So let me express my idea. I just wanted to thank everyone who participated in this meeting, people from CSOs, religious groups, private sector. Really, I mean this. It is so rich to be able to have participated in this meeting. Of course, we hear different voices that often disagree, but that is what makes our societies and our region richer. And we must work to agree in disagreement, agree that we can disagree, to have understanding for those who do not agree with you. And we need to be explicit and to be passionate about what we feel, but to be rational at the same time. So I am so grateful to you. The Permanent Council is as well. And this session is adjourned. Thank you.